Hello, everyone, and welcome, Kimy and Nathalie. Kimy is her screen alias is Cool Hans, for those of you who don't see.
My son.
Yeah. But so I should say that it's one of the nice things about this series for me is not only revisiting the work, but revisiting the artists with whom we've worked, because we pour so much of ourselves out in the weeks that we're staging and learning these things musically and theatrically, and then we do the performances and we're gone, and so seeing these artists again is a great pleasure, as well as seeing them and listening to the music and watching the video again. Today, what I thought I'd tell you first, what we've skipped over. For those of you who have been with us past week, you saw Pizarro's entrance and you saw Rocco and Pizarro's duet. What comes next in the opera, in both the Gaveaux and the Beethoven's Leonore, is a wonderful duet between Leonore and Marceline. And it's where they're thinking very different things. Marceline wanting to think about love and having babies, and Leonore trying to keep her at a distance without pushing her off entirely. And so right now, we are looking today at the Leonore aria in Gaveaux and Leonore aria in Beethoven, which are right after that scene. And this may be kind of interesting for both Kimy and Nathalie to look at, because in fact, both of them have played Leonore for us, but they've also played Marceline in the Beethoven's Fidelio, not Leonore, but in Fidelio. And so they have they might have an interesting perspective on both roles. The other thing that I think today really gives us an opportunity to do is, whereas the duet that we just passed over is very similar, the Beethoven and the Gaveaux are so alike. It's but these Leonore arias, they're alike in some ways and they're very different in others. And I think that it's an interesting moment to look at, and it also gives us an opportunity to go back and talk a little bit about more of the Gaveaux, both musically and theatrically, than we've been able to talk about in the last few sessions. And so I'd like to just point out some obvious, perhaps not, similarities. First of all, there's the incredible role for the horn in the orchestra, in both arias. For one horn, a solo in the opening of the Gaveaux aria, very expressive solo, and then for three horns together in the Beethoven, who accompany and both in the slow and the fast section of Beethoven's Leonore aria. There's also this move from the minor to the major, and reflecting a sort of an attitude, a different feeling and attitude that Leonore has. But on the other hand, structurally, the two arias are very different, and I think they respond to the poetry in different ways and have different strengths, and I'd hope we might get into those. And then also we have, if you saw the Gaveaux has a lot more dialogue, and particularly this excerpt after, both a little bit before the aria, but a fair amount afterwards, right up into what will be the prisoner's chorus. And that in the Gaveaux, that has it's not only, it has an interesting effect because it leads to a kind of musical or musicological mystery for us, which is that Kimy has Leonore has in the Gaveaux a second aria which is missing. And in our production, she says the text of it right after the chiming of the bell in the background. And that has a special effect, which is something different from what we see in the Beethoven. So I think what I'd like first to do maybe is say hello, Kimy and Nathalie, and have first Kimy talk a little bit about her aria, although it's been 2 years since you sung it, and then Nathalie to speak about her experience, and then Nathalie, of course, will also be able to speak about how this aria is different from the Fidelio Leonore aria, and it is in really significant ways. So, Kimy, would you like to tell us a little about your experience and with this?
Yes, hi everyone. I'm glad to be here. I'm a little nervous, I must admit. So, Leonore in the Gaveaux as an interpret in a way. I'm not a musicologist or anything like that. So it's 2 strophes. The first one, it's the same music both times. So the first one, she describes her time spent, her torment. She described a bit how how were things at Rocco's, and then afterwards she's speaking more about her new hope of finally getting to see her husband, hoping he's still alive, and rescue him. And then afterwards, the little aria that is actually a text, in my opinion, it's more like a prayer. She hopes that everything is going to be fine. She talks a bit also, we discover a bit about her feelings for Rocco, and how, yeah, he's a harsh man, but he has a good heart. He's letting me in. That's my chance. I need to seize it. It's scary. I can risk a lot, but I'm going to seize it and hope for the best. So that's my journey, my emotional journey through my aria and my post aria.
Yeah, I should say that for me, the 2 most moving moments in this section are the beginning as the horn solo, which our first horn Todd Williams played so brilliantly, and then it goes into the aria. And when you start singing and that sort of just out of that recitative, it's very natural, and I find it very moving. And then similarly, at the end, what you just talked about, the chimes, and you're speaking about a prayer. You mentioned it as a prayer, and we were joking, Nathalie and I, and the whole cast actually, about how many times in the Beethoven we hear the word Gott and God, yeah. and we've been joking a little bit, and when we talked with Pascal about how the Gaveaux is much more secular and yet that moment that you speak of, I think when she does literally speak to God after the chimes, and we hear the chimes, and of course they remind us of church bells, and she's speaking about opening up the doors, and she opens up the doors very slowly, and talks about how the moment of letting the prisoners come out for air is so important. And so what's interesting for me is in the Gaveaux, the 2 moving moments for me are, one musical, and then the other is without music. It's the theatrical one. And of course, Gaveaux has so much more theater in it than music, whereas Beethoven is so much more music than theater. Yeah. And so I'm glad you brought those 2 up. But you also mentioned it's a strophic. That is, your aria is 2 bits of music which are the same, except for the introduction by the horn and the final. Then it goes into major just for a short bit at the end. And the second strophe, that is your second words underneath that same music, when you turn to thinking about him, about Florestan, it doesn't change in the same way that it will change, and Nathalie can tell us about how it changes, how that, when she starts to think about him, her aria changes. So I think that for me, there's some of these great strong points about the Gaveaux, and yet that maybe that second strophe is a little bit of a weak point.
Yeah,
formally.
Yeah, I believe it's a big challenge because it's exactly like you said, the same music for the display of 2 very different emotions. And the fact that the Gaveaux, there's more text. Normally, in my understanding, the text is there to make the the plot go faster, develop the story in the opera, and the music is there for the display of emotion. Now, for the display of my two very different emotions, the same music. So the challenge is to make the word different, perfume it a little bit differently to pass two different messages. Not always obvious.
Yeah, and hard to do because Gaveaux doesn't help you so much there.
No, but I think it's proper to that era, maybe.
Yeah, well, he does write, and we'll talk about. He writes a more different strophic aria for Florestan, in which we'll talk about at another session. But the other moment that I thought, speaking of acting, that when it moves to the major in the end of your aria, suddenly you have the kind of resolute, and your acting changes it completely in a wonderful way, that you are resolute, you're going to go save him. And that, of course, is really lengthened in the Beethoven. Her resolution, and that is shown for a long time. And I thought maybe that is a nice intro to have Nathalie, to have you speak a little about the form of your aria and your reaction to it.
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to join you here today. Can you hear me well?
Yeah.
Yes, excellent. Yeah, it's so wonderful to hear you talk about all of those details, because on the one hand, what I observed, and I have to admit, I listened to Kymy's aria in Gaveaux a few days ago, and it is absolutely divine and so different and fabulous. I mean, I adore Kimy. She loves that. She knows that. She's amazing. And what is not given in the music is all given musically, as you just described, Rai. And it's very interesting. Big emotions musically, the colors in Beethoven. It's the difficulty. In a way, this is something that's easy in a way for us. The music tells the story. The music brings all this emotion, and the difference is all written in. What's difficult is you have to physically and vocally. It's quite demanding, and quite intense, I would say. I really look forward to hear the whole Gaveaux from beginning to end, and to see how those two were treated, and how different the other aspects of things are. But it was such a wonderful thing to hear the same emotions in words, music, and words again, and the text being so differently set up, of course, with the Gaveaux, the Beethoven.
Yeah, the beginning, the introduction, your introduction in the Beethoven is much more dramatic rather than somber, and then it moves into, I think, the section which doesn't really exist in the Gaveaux that exists in this Beethoven version is the middle section, the Komm Hoffnung, and the beautiful text about, will I reach that star, that distant star? Yeah. And I find that that's the moving moment for me in your Beethoven aria, which is a different kind of feeling than in the Gaveaux, that creating a slightly different text of literally speaking to hope, come hope, and I'll reach that last star. And in the adagio, because you have the recitative, the adagio with that hope section, and then of course the really long extended heroic, I'll go save for conjugal love. I will go save him.
Exactly. Yeah. Which is, in a way, my interpretation of that was convincing herself over and over again that she can do it. So there's a hint of maybe her doubt about herself, especially at the beginning, I would say. Not so much doubt, but a premonition and hope that she is right about that premonition in the first blurb of text, the little a text at the beginning before even the recit. My man is there. I can feel that he is there. I'm sure he's there, and I will go and save him. And then, of course, that wonderful prayer, but prayer in songs, of course, in the music itself. Komm Hoffnung.
Right. Right. Maybe you're right. Maybe that's a substitute, right? If he takes what Kymy's Leonore does in the missing aria text, that's what you're doing in that middle section. That's interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
In a way, I feel that this is, even though it's not necessarily a prayer to God or there's no words to describe that, it's definitely a call to
Yeah.
energies around to help and give me courage, of course. So 1, 2, 3, 3 sections, I would say, in this aria, ending with a bravura, hope.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You both mentioned having to work with. I mean, in your saying, you have to convince yourself in that long allegro. You're dealing with Beethoven. I mean, Beethoven cut this down for Fidelio later. He made it shorter, and you have to say it a lot of times, and you have to find a theatrical reason to make that work. The same way Kimy had to make the text different on the second round of her melody. So that's it's interesting to me to see how singers have to work with what they've been given, and sometimes the composer makes it easy, and sometimes he doesn't.
Yeah.
So
and
yeah.
And if I may speak now about on the difference between what we know that became Abscheulicher, which is the aria equivalent in the version that we know of Beethoven. It's very interesting to see what he chose and to try to imagine why from the first performance of it. And Ryan, maybe you can describe how, because you're much better read about that the premise of the first Beethoven and when it was presented as an introduction to what I will say.
Well, the big difference, of course, is that in Fidelio, there is no duet with Marceline right before. And you react to Pizarro or at least if you were singing Fidelio, the 1814 version, you'd sing Abscheulicher, which is the most heavy, kind of heavily dramatic piece that in some ways that Leonore might have to sing in Fidelio. Whereas this is a more, here you're coming out of that duet and it's a more nuanced reaction and emotion. Then it's not reacting directly to Pizarro at all. And so Beethoven, there's something special about this version that goes with the duet before, and something special about Fidelio, which goes with coming straight out of reacting to the evil guy there, right? I think.
And I think in the most recent, the Fidelio version, obviously, it's a much more of a bravura beginning, and therefore, hence, and the whole aria is much more. It's a heavier aria as well.
Yes, and doesn't have that incredible melisma that you sing at the end with the bassoon. With the bassoon, you have to be exactly together.
Absolutely.
It's amazing. Yeah.
A little pyrotechnically set for the voice and the bassoon. So yes, in a way, it's a much, like you say, it's a much gentler segue into the aria, and it stems from maybe what Marcellina says. She's going to go to the prison, and the thought for Leonora then is there. He is there, and not necessarily talking about feeling at all at odds, or not focusing on Pizarro, but focusing on the fact that she needs to gather all her energy, keep it together, keep this little lie going for a little longer so that she can go and deliver him and save him from this bad guy. It saves the big drama or the big not tragic, but bravura moment, I think, for the end of the aria. As for the Beethoven, I feel like it starts really on and intense right from the get-go.
You mean from the Fidelio?
Yeah, from the Fidelio, sorry, from the Fidelio.
Right.
Decision that was made by Auriol, I think it's brilliant, absolutely. So that did not happen in the Gaveaux. I'm so sorry, I didn't see. Yeah. No. Oh, yeah. Well, that maybe came later. Yes. Yeah.
For me, it was more the scarf that would have been his but it doesn't read as well as you really looking at the picture. I think it anchors more.
Yeah.
Where you start from where you go. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I love the fact that that Kirby brought up the parallelism to the Florestan, because I hadn't I hadn't thought of it. But last week we talked about the parallelism between Marceline giving Leonore a cup of something to drink just before the quartet, which of course there's no quartet in it, but she still gives you something to drink in the Gaveaux, and the parallel of that to her giving Florestan, well, Rocco and she giving Florestan something to eat and drink in the trio in the Act 3. And so that's, I think both Beethoven, the librettist, and our director Oriol are working consciously to make an integral whole out of this, which is really interesting. Of course, the Fiordiligi, a great aria is the one that comes to my mind, but I'm sure there were ones from other composers as well, and so that's of course Mozart's Così. And if nobody has any others, I thought if Kristina is still there, I'd like her to bring up the point that she made to me after the last week about an interesting relationship between Leonore and Rocco, that dialogue that we actually did not say in our opera.
I could talk about that, but I think there's actually something about Leonore's aria that might be even more pertinent today.
Great. Go ahead.
Which is, I think it's useful to know, and we don't know when the change was made, but in the 1805 libretto of Sonnleitner, the structure of the aria was identical to Bouilly's structure. It was meant to be a strophic air, with the first verse addressed to the heart and the second verse addressed to the absent Florestan. And at some point when Beethoven decided to turn this into an Italian scena with a recitative and a slow section and then a fast section, this verse Komm Hoffnung was added. But it doesn't appear in the published libretto that was used for the performance. It happens at some point in between. The words resemble in some ways a song that Beethoven had just set, An die Hoffnung. But I think thinking about the many ways, so we get an appeal to the heart, and then an apostrophe to hope, and then an aria addressed to the absent Florestan, which is kind of overloaded maybe.
That's interesting, because one of the things that, and we'll talk about this in a couple of weeks when we talk about Florestan's aria, is that in Will Crutchfield's digging into the origins of it, there's some evidence that at one time Beethoven also thought about that as a strophic aria, like Gaveaux said. Although Gaveaux's strophic aria ended up being the different strokes were more different in the orchestra as well as the words. So I don't think I knew that. That's great.
And you were asking about in the Bouilly libretto, at the end of scene 7, right before Leonore's second aria, is a really interesting dialogue between Leonore and Rocco, in which Leonore puts words into Rocco's mouth to test him. And so says, what are we actually doing? We're only opening the cistern. We don't have to think about what might happen next. It's our job to follow orders and never to question those orders, even if those orders should be a crime.
Mm-hmm.
And Rock agrees and is delighted that Fidelio thinks just like he does. And that's what prompts Leonore's second aria, that is this appeal to hope and God. And so thinking about how they're conflated, I think, is really interesting. In the course of the duet, Rocco persuades himself, in order to be able to take the money, that killing Florestan is an act of mercy.
Right, right, right.
And so some of
Which
that
is
complicity is.
Yeah. The moral trajectory and that Rocco goes is, as we talked about a couple of last session, so interesting, and that kind of rationale that he then fortunately eventually abandons. Well, next week we're going, one of the reasons I wanted to keep the Gaveaux dialogue after, we're going to actually repeat it so that you can see how the Gaveaux Prisoner's Chorus is introduced. And how similar it is to the Beethoven. But you also see that Beethoven and Gaveaux, that Beethoven reordered, or Sonnleitner reordered some of the action in his Leonore that Gaveaux had in one way. Beethoven takes some of it and puts it after the Prisoner's Chorus. For me, it's even with the lengthened arias and things, it still flew by. But then we were all kind of busy.